The sound of my cousin Daniel's laughter didn't simply echo across the conference room, it cut through it. The kind of loud, chest-deep laughter meant to perform, to dominate, to humiliate. We were sitting around a long, polished cherrywood table in the law office my father had trusted for decades. The blinds were half closed, slicing thin bars of winter light across the floor. The attorney, Mr. Langford, sat at the head of the table, fingers folded neatly over a stack of files. Everything was orderly, subdued, until Daniel saw the number next to my name. He slapped his palm flat against the table and leaned back sharply, as though the force of his amusement needed space to expand. "Well, would you look at that," he said, wiping a theatrical tear from the corner of his eye. "Eleanor's inheritance is smaller than the gratuity on one of my lunch bills." Uncle Arthur really did have a sense of humor. The other cousins didn't laugh, though they tried to hide their smirks, as if smiling would soften their guilt. I sat with my hands folded gently in my lap, watching Daniel's performance with the kind of stillness I'd learned long ago, stillness that made men like him uneasy. I wasn't offended. I wasn't even surprised. Daniel had always enjoyed punching down, especially if he believed no one would punch back. What he didn't notice was the way Mr. Langford's jaw tightened. Or how he adjusted the edge of a sealed cream envelope at his side, an envelope addressed to me in my father's unmistakably elegant handwriting. My father rarely left anything to chance. That envelope alone should have warned Daniel to temper his theatrics, but he didn't see it. People like him rarely look beyond their own reflection. "Well," Daniel said, leaning toward my younger cousin as though sharing a private joke, "I guess all those years Eleanor spent reading books didn't exactly pay off." Still, no one laughed with him. The air changed then, subtle at first, like a room remembering its rules. Langford cleared his throat and tapped the envelope twice with deliberate weight. The sound, soft, decisive, finally broke through Daniel's self-satisfied haze. "There is," Langford said, "a conditional clause in the will that must be read before we proceed." Daniel rolled his eyes. "A clause? What, some sentimental note about family unity?" "No," Langford replied, his voice steady but edged with something sharper. "A clause your uncle added to protect the integrity of his estate." Daniel blinked. Then Langford slid the sealed envelope toward me. "This was written for Eleanor. She is to open it now." I hesitated only a second before breaking the wax seal. The paper inside was thick, heavy, my father's preferred stationery for anything meaningful. As I unfolded it, a hush fell over the room so total it seemed to swallow the ticking of the ornate wall clock. My father's handwriting flowed across the page in a firm, confident script. I read the first line silently, then the second. By the third, my breath caught. The conditional clause wasn't symbolic. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't small. It was a mechanism, one designed to activate only if certain actions were taken against the estate. Actions that, unbeknownst to him, Daniel had already committed. The laughter stopped. Every muscle in Daniel's face shifted as though someone had quietly pulled the ground out from beneath him. And as I finished reading my father's words, I understood something Daniel didn't. My tiny inheritance was not the end of the story. It was the fuse. And it had just been lit. My name is Eleanor Grant, and at 63 years old, I've learned that silence is often the most underestimated form of strength. People mistake it for fragility, for timidity, for the inability to defend oneself. But silence, when used with intention, becomes a shield, and sometimes, even a blade. I never needed the spotlight my cousin Daniel chased relentlessly. I preferred quiet corners, books whose pages held the steady heartbeat of truth, and conversations with my father that deepened rather than drained. I built a life of small, steady joys. 35 years as a school librarian teaches a person a great deal about human nature. Children confess to librarians more easily than they do to teachers or parents. Somehow we become keepers of secrets. In return, we learn to recognize deception before it fully forms. My father always teased me for this intuition, joking that I could dismantle a person's falsehoods faster than he could draft a legal brief. He meant it kindly. And though I never became a lawyer, I carried that skill into every room I entered. My father's decline was slow at first, a forgotten appointment, a mislaid set of keys. Later it became hospital visits, whispered discussions with specialists, the sound of monitors cutting into the night. I moved into his home not out of obligation, but out of love. Our evenings became slower but richer, the crackle of his fireplace, the rhythm of his breath, the quiet satisfaction of companionship built across decades. Daniel rarely came. When he did, it was brief, loud, performative. He always brought something, pastries, a small gadget, a magazine, but it was never about my father. It was about the appearance of attentiveness. He'd breeze in, charm the nurse, boast about a deal in the works, then slip out with an armful of leftovers, claiming he didn't want them to go to waste. My father watched all of it. He said nothing, but his eyes saw everything. Those last months, he asked me questions that felt half philosophical, half practical. What did I believe fairness meant? What did I value above comfort? How would I handle conflict if forced to? I answered as honestly as I could. I told him that integrity mattered more to me than any temporary victory. He gave a faint, knowing smile, one I would not understand until the day of the will reading. I remember the exact moment I realized he had anticipated everything, the laughter, the entitlement, the eventual confrontation. His envelope was not just a legal formality. It was a message from a man who understood his family's cracks long before they split open. And as I held that envelope, my fingers trembling slightly, I realized something else. My father hadn't simply left me an inheritance. He'd left me a responsibility. And Daniel was about to discover that responsibility carried weight. My family is one of those families that photographs well but lives poorly. Gatherings were always arranged around someone's idea of harmony rather than actual affection. My father had been the glue, the dignified eldest sibling who believed in generosity tempered with boundaries. When he passed, the unspoken hierarchy collapsed almost instantly. My cousins drifted into their familiar archetypes. Miriam, gentle but passive, forever caught in the undertow of stronger personalities. Keith, the skeptic who distrusted institutions but ignored his own lack of discipline. And then there was Daniel, the sun around which he believed we all ought to orbit. Growing up, Daniel and I were different in ways that felt almost architectural. His personality built outward, loud, insistent, constantly expanding. Mine built inward, layer by layer, calm, quiet, deliberate. He liked to tease me for being bookish, as if literacy were a flaw. But what always struck me was how much energy he spent trying to be impressive, and how little time he spent becoming someone worthy of admiration. As teenagers, the gap widened. Daniel borrowed things without asking. He pushed boundaries, then feigned innocence. He lied about small things, where he'd been, who he'd seen, why money had gone missing from an aunt's purse. The adults forgave him with weary sighs. I learned from him, not by imitation, but by contrast. When my father fell ill, the family dynamic sharpened. My caregiving became the quiet center around which the final year revolved. Daniel's visits became increasingly rare, and increasingly transactional. He asked questions not about my father's comfort, but about the estate. Not about his health, but about the property. And every time he asked, my father would give a gentle but distant response, as though taking mental notes. I sometimes wondered if Daniel saw me as an obstacle rather than a person. He spoke to me with polite condescension, masking impatience beneath sugar-coated words. It wasn't cruelty, it was dismissal. And in families, dismissal can cut deeper than hostility. But my father had not raised me to confront with heat. He had raised me to confront with truth. Those long evenings we spent discussing the estate were not about money, they were about values. He told me stories from his youth, of relatives who had destroyed themselves with greed, of silent betrayals that tore branches from the family tree. People show their truest selves, he said, when they believe they are entitled to something. I didn't know then how prophetic that statement would be. When the will reading approached, everyone assumed Daniel would inherit the largest share. He assumed it too. And perhaps that assumption was the first step in his unraveling. Because entitlement blinds a person long before justice corrects them. And Daniel was walking into that room wearing a blindfold he had stitched himself. The day I found the cabinet empty, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear. Not anger. Something quieter, an internal click, like the first piece of a puzzle finding its place. My father's locked document cabinet was almost ceremonial, mahogany, secured with a brass key, always handled with reverence. After his death, I approached it as one might approach a relic, carefully, respectfully. But when I opened it, the breath left my lungs. The folders were aligned neatly, but their contents were gone. Not scattered or disrupted, removed. This wasn't chaos. This was intention. Only two keys existed, mine, which remained on my own ring, and my father's, which he kept in a ceramic dish on his desk. But the dish sat empty now, its shallow curve holding nothing but a faint dust ring where the key once lay. I replayed the previous weeks. Daniel had visited shortly before my father's death, sweeping through the house with the self-assurance of someone who believed proximity equaled ownership. He claimed he wanted to help organize. In truth, he touched everything except my father's actual needs. I remembered hearing him in the study. The drawer of the desk sliding open. The pause. The soft clink of ceramic. He must have taken the key then. And once my father passed, he had returned. Quietly. A thief disguised as family. But what he stole was not the estate. It was his own future. I didn't tell anyone at first. I needed confirmation. I needed clarity. So I catalogued what was missing: preliminary trust structures, tax summaries, a draft inventory of assets. Documents that, taken out of context, might have convinced Daniel he held valuable leverage. But the real estate plan, the legal backbone, remained untouched in Langford's secure archives, just as my father intended. Daniel's ambition had made him clumsy. He had taken the wrong documents. And in doing so, he triggered my father's hidden protective clause, one designed precisely for such a violation. The clause ensured that any heir who tampered with or attempted to manipulate the estate forfeited their share entirely. The forfeited amount would then be transferred to the beneficiary chosen for integrity and responsibility. Me. The magnitude of the betrayal didn't break me. It clarified me. But I still wanted proof, not because I doubted what happened, but because truth requires light, not assumption. And I intended to shine that light so brightly that no one could question the outcome. I gathered everything quietly: dates, photos, messages, witness statements. I prepared not for war, but for truth. And the truth was about to land with the weight of a lifetime's worth of misjudgment. I brought everything to Langford in a single neat folder. His office had the stillness of a place where many lives had been sorted, rebalanced, and occasionally repaired. He reviewed each piece of evidence with the disciplined care my father had admired in him. The timeline was irrefutable. The behavior was undeniable. The violation was complete. Langford leaned back in his chair, tapping the folder lightly. "Eleanor," he said, "your father anticipated something like this." He opened his own drawer and removed a separate file, thicker, heavier, marked with a red tag. "The bonus trust," he said. I stared at the words, uncertain. "It was created privately," he explained. "Your father wanted to reward the heir who demonstrated honesty and responsibility. But he also wanted to protect the estate from any relative who felt entitled to it." He paused, letting the meaning settle. "The clause activates only if misconduct occurs. And once activated, it cannot be reversed." Daniel's inheritance, his assumed victory, had been erased by his own hand. The trust, once dormant, was now fully funded, by the very portion Daniel had forfeited. I felt neither triumph nor guilt. Only a deep, resonant confirmation that my father had understood us all far better than we realized. Still, I wasn't ready for confrontation. Not yet. Truth without preparation is chaos. Truth with documentation is justice. so I requested the digital access logs from the estate archives. I compiled Daniel's visit dates, his messages hinting at getting ahead of paperwork, and the testimony from the housekeeper who saw him near the study after my father's death. Each piece slid into place. Each piece strengthened the inevitable. Langford set the completed file on his desk. "This," he said, "is airtight." I nodded. "Schedule the will reading. All cousins present." He gave a small, knowing smile. "It will be something." But even he didn't know how silent the room would become. Or how swiftly a man like Daniel could crumble when stripped of the illusion of power. The night before the will reading, I sat in my father's old leather chair. It enveloped me the way it always had, its familiar scent of cedar and worn pages grounding me. The house was quiet. Enough that I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Time seemed to move differently in that room, slower, deliberate, almost ceremonial. I held the envelope again, rereading my father's words. They weren't vengeful. They weren't punitive. They were protective. Loving. Strategic. He had believed in accountability, not punishment. And he had trusted me, not because I wanted control, but because I didn't crave it. "I never meant for this to burden you," he had written. "I only meant for truth to find its proper path." His handwriting steadied me. But a question lingered. Was I ready to be the one to speak truth in a room full of people who once dismissed me? I closed my eyes and allowed myself to feel everything: grief, steadiness, a faint tremor of anticipation. Conflict had never been my instinct. But protecting my father's final intentions, that was a calling I could not ignore. I picked up the phone and called Langford. "I'm ready," I said. And I was. Not for battle. Not for revenge. But for correction. For the restoration of something my father valued: integrity, unshaken by noise or ego. Still, as I drifted to sleep, I couldn't shake the sense that Daniel, cornered, exposed, might retaliate in some last attempt at control. But the truth has a way of rendering even the loudest voices strangely small. And by the next afternoon, Daniel's voice would fall silent altogether. Daniel's downfall unfolded with a kind of quiet precision I hadn't expected. He arrived at the will reading wearing a smug, anticipatory grin, the grin of a man who believed the world was about to validate his assumptions. But when Langford began reading the honesty clause, Daniel's posture changed. At first, confusion. Then irritation. Then something colder, a flicker of fear. Langford presented each piece of evidence calmly, unemotionally, like stones placed one by one into a scale. The missing key. The housekeeper's testimony. The dates matching Daniel's unsupervised visits. The absence of any digital compromise in the official archives. The automatic activation of the clause. Daniel's complexion flickered between red and ash. He tried bravado first. "This is ridiculous. You think I'd steal paperwork? For what? I was helping, everyone knows that." Langford didn't flinch. Intent is irrelevant. Action is what triggers the clause. Then came the bargaining. "Look, I probably misplaced something. Why don't we just redistribute or something? Eleanor doesn't need all that." No one responded. Finally came the quiet collapse, the moment his ego folded inward and he realized the room no longer belonged to him. "You can't do this," he whispered. "Your uncle did," Langford replied. Daniel stood so abruptly his chair toppled over, clattering against the floor. He stormed out, muttering about lawyers, lawsuits, conspiracies. But even he knew those threats were empty. Contesting the will would only bring further scrutiny his actions could not withstand. And just like that, the loudest man in the family fell silent. Not with drama. Not with spectacle. But with the heavy, irreversible weight of truth. The weeks that followed felt strangely peaceful. Estate matters concluded smoothly once Daniel's disruption dissolved. I used the bonus trust not as a windfall, but as a stewardship. I repaired my father's home, established a literacy scholarship in his honor, and made donations to the charities he'd quietly supported for years. My cousins reached out with softer voices now, not out of fear, but recalibration. They saw me differently, perhaps for the first time. Not as the quiet librarian in the corner, but as someone shaped by resolve. Daniel, however, disappeared from family gatherings. I heard bits and pieces, business ventures collapsing, creditors calling, a general unraveling. I didn't celebrate his misfortune. I simply refused to carry responsibility for it. One afternoon I visited my father's grave with a thermos of warm tea. The cemetery was hushed, blanketed in early spring light. I stood beneath the large oak tree that shadowed his headstone, tracing the engraved lines of his name. "I did it right," I said softly. "Just the way you taught me." A breeze swept through the branches, scattering soft gold sunlight across the grass. For the first time since his passing, I felt something close to closure. Not victory. Not triumph. Just peace. Now, months later, the lesson of it all sits with me like a well-worn book, pages creased, cover softened, wisdom absorbed quietly over time. People often assume vengeance requires fury. But the most ethical revenge, if one must call it that, is simply allowing truth to run its full course. My father understood that better than anyone. And now, so do I. The world will always have Daniels, people who mistake entitlement for aptitude, loudness for authority, and manipulation for cleverness. But the world also has quiet people, steady people, people who look unassuming until the moment integrity requires them to stand firm. If I've learned anything, it's this. Character is the true inheritance. And when tested, it reveals everything: who loses, who wins, and who simply endures. My tiny inheritance became the doorway to a greater truth. Daniel's downfall became a mirror he could no longer avoid. And my father's final gift wasn't money. It was clarity. And clarity, once revealed, cannot be taken from you.